Hey everyone, and welcome. So, we're always told to trust the science, right? And a huge part of that trust comes when we see a study that gets a good grade. But what if the very systems that hand out those grades are, well, kind of flawed? Who's actually grading the graders? Let's dig in. You've seen this a million times, I'm sure. A headline pops up that says some new study got an A plus for its evidence. And that feels great. It feels solid. But what does that A plus really mean? Where did it come from? It turns out that grade is the final step in a really complex process, a process that might not be nearly as objective as we all think. These grades are the product of what we call grading systems, and you can think of them as these powerful, almost invisible gatekeepers of science. They're the tools that researchers and policymakers use to decide which studies get to influence everything, from the medical advice your doctor gives you to massive public health policies. So, what is a grading system at its heart? Well, it's basically a rubric. Its job is to take this mountain of super complex research and boil it all down to a simple, easy to understand score or grade. The whole point is to separate the strong, solid evidence from the weak stuff. And, that sounds incredibly useful, doesn't it? Now, what's really important to get is that there's not just one universal grading system. Nope, it's more like a whole toolbox full of different instruments. Some are for grading a single study, like the Downs and Black tool. Others, like the grade system, are designed to look at a whole body of evidence on a topic. And then you've got the specialists, like the JADAD scale, which is built specifically for one type of study, the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. But this is where it starts to get a little messy. See, when scientists decided to turn the microscope around and investigate the toolbox itself, they found some pretty big cracks in the foundation. It turns out these super important tools we rely on have some major and often totally unacknowledged problems. Okay, so problem number one is kind of ironic. A whole bunch of these tools for grading scientific evidence don't actually have much scientific evidence to back them up. Seriously, a shocking number have never been properly validated to prove that they're reliable or that they even measure what they're supposed to be measuring. Just let that sink in for a second. We're using scientifically unproven tools to decide what science is proven. And this isn't just a theoretical problem. It has very real consequences. Because the tools aren't consistent, you can get completely different answers depending on which one you use. Get this. In one review, researchers looked at a bunch of studies on Tai Chi. When they used one grading tool called Oxman's criteria, the research was basically dismissed as low quality. But when they used a different tool, the JADAD scale, that exact same research was rated as safe and effective. Same evidence, totally opposite conclusions. Wild, right? And on top of that, you've got the human element. At the end of the day, that final grade isn't spit out by a perfect, objective machine. It's decided by a person or a group of people. And that process can be super subjective. A researcher's background, their personal opinions, or even just how much experience they have with a specific tool can seriously sway the final grade. And finally, there's a big one. A lot of these systems just have a built-in bias. They're designed with this rigid hierarchy of evidence that automatically puts one type of study, the randomized controlled trial, at the very top of the pyramid. This means that sometimes even a really sloppy, poorly done RCT can get a higher grade than a brilliant, rock-solid observational study just because of its design. So, look, these aren't just abstract academic issues we're talking about. These flaws have real-world consequences. Sometimes they can cause incredibly important, game-changing scientific discoveries to be unfairly downgraded or even ignored. Let's look at a couple of real-life examples. All right, check this out. Back in 2010, there was a huge report on preventing Alzheimer's disease that used the grade system. It looked at a bunch of known risk factors, like smoking, and it rated the evidence for them as low. But why? Was the evidence actually weak? No, it was because all the evidence came from observational studies. The system automatically knocks those down a peg, even though doing a randomized trial where you force one group of people to smoke is, well, obviously completely unethical and impossible. So the best possible evidence we could ever get was still labeled low quality. Or how about the incredible story of how we discovered that a bacteria, not stress, causes most stomach ulcers? In the 80s, two researchers, Marshall and Warren, proposed this idea based on their observations. The scientific community basically laughed them out of the room. So, to prove his point, one of them, Barry Marshall, did something crazy. He drank a beaker of the bacteria and gave himself an ulcer. Of course, he was right and they eventually won a Nobel Prize. But just think, his initial world-changing work was observational. A rigid grading system could have just dismissed it as low-quality evidence, and that would have been that. Okay, so we've seen how these flaws can mess with specific findings. But what does all this mean for the big picture? I mean, it's pretty clear these grading systems aren't perfect. And the stakes for public health and the policies that affect all of us, they're incredibly high. And here's the crucial point. When good, solid evidence gets wrongly stamped with a low-quality label, the results can be genuinely dangerous. As the authors of our source paper put it, when that link between smoking and Alzheimer's gets a low evidence rating, smokers or tobacco companies could directly interpret that as reassurance that their use of tobacco is not linked with increased risk. That is a huge problem. Now, the big takeaway here is not to become cynical or to just dismiss science. Absolutely not. The goal is to become a smarter, more critical consumer of it. It's about understanding that the process we use to judge research, the how, is just as important as the research itself. We just need to be aware of the limitations of the tools being used. Which, of course, leaves us with this massive question. If the systems themselves have problems, how do we decide what science to trust? Well, since there's no perfect system, it really falls to us to be more aware of the context, the potential biases, and the kind of evidence we're looking at. So the next time you see a scientific grade, don't just ask, what was the score? Ask, who graded it? How did they do it? And what might they have missed? That's how we all get a little smarter about science. Thanks for watching.